Alright, welcome back. Today we're talking about the French Revolution. The French Revolution really took place between 1789 and 1799, and France went through this huge violent revolt that overthrew the French monarchy and established a new constitution. You need to know, though, that this movement was started by the Enlightenment ideas, and the reform movements that came about and the new policies that were there were from all the philosophies and all of the ideas that came out of the Enlightenment. Let's start with one of the first ones we're going to talk about is Absolutism and how that played a part in the reforms and what needed to be done. The period lasting roughly from 1600 to 1800 is often referred to as the Age of Absolutism. Monarchs during this time exercised complete authority and did not share power with any of the councils or cabinet or anyone. In fact, they believed in the divine right of the kings, which meant that whatever king was in charge was given that charge by God himself, and that the only one who could tell him what to do was God, or that he communicated and knew exactly what God wanted him to do. Historians often identify James I of England as one of the very first absolute rulers. Not only did James believe that monarchs should hold total power, but he also wrote extensively about the divine right of kings. In his work, The True Law of Free Monarchies, he stated that kings are called gods because they sit upon God, his throne in the earth, and have the count of their administration to give unto him. Basically saying that they're in charge of everything that God has put in front of them, and therefore they have the right to make absolute decisions. This system right here is the Seigneurial System. This feudal system, we've talked about feudalism, and it had been going on since the Middle Ages, but the feudal method of land ownership was with a king, and then you had lords, knights, noblemen, serfs, and even peasants down below that. And what it would do is this system was a tier system, and it kept peasants mostly in the labor force. So everything was done by, all the manual labor was done by the peasants. King Louis XIV. Before France in their revolution is often referred to as Ancien Regime. During this time period of more than 130 years, the country had just two rulers. The first was King Louis XIV, who had a powerful impact on France during his long reign, and is considered by many as the epitome of an absolutist ruler. So he was the epitome of in charge of everything, making sure that every decision went through him. He centralized power in himself at the expense of the nobility, removing them from positions as governors and administrators and relocating them into different roles. Basically, he had the royal palace of Versailles, and he, from that palace, would rule and moved all the nobles where he wanted them, put them in place where he said they could be. And King Louis implemented policies that led France to emerge as a dominant power in the continental Europe. He increased the nation's standing army and fought 4 years between 1667 and 1713. These wars added to France's international standing and prestige, but it left the country deeply in debt, and King Louis increased his debt by undertaking both public construction, so he built roads and canals, and royal buildings and projects. These included the Palace of Versailles. He also spent huge sums maintaining a lavish lifestyle for the royal court at Versailles. It wasn't just clothing for him. If you were part of the group that traveled with the king or met with the king, you had a certain standard of clothing, a certain standard that you had to live. When we think of the kings and queens, think of Benjamin Franklin. When he went to get help from France, they were embarrassed to let him see the king because he was bald and he didn't actually have a wig with him. And they couldn't find a wig big enough to fit his head, and it was such an emergency that he said, I need to talk to the king anyway. And the people were embarrassed by that. Now, what we have right here is King Louis XV. The 7 Years' War was the war that was fought between the British and the French on what we consider now North American soil. As their continued debt increased, they needed to find more revenues for money. The war pitted the British and the Prussians on one side against the French, the Austrians, and the Russians, as well as the Native Americans. The fighting took place not just in Europe, but also in India and North America, where the war was also known as the French and Indian War, because the France had allied so much with the Native Americans. Though the war ended up as a stalemate in Europe, France suffered defeats to the British in North America and in India. As a result, it forced them to cede some of the colonial possessions. Much of the burden of paying for the war fell onto the peasantry. So now we're starting to build a story. The kings and queens have decided we're going to go to war, and who pays for it? The peasants. Now they had a system of monitoring and taking care of their country, and this was the three estates. In French society, the people were divided into these three different categories called estates. Each estate had a specific role or privilege. The first estate was consisted of the church. The second estate was nobility or aristocracy, and the third included almost the rest of French society, peasants, the common people. The third estate was the poorest of the group and provided most of the nation's taxes, so the poor provided all the money. Tax dollars were used to pay for wars, to pay for the king's palace, to support the wealthy lifestyle of the aristocracy, and to pay for other public projects. So the poor did get to utilize the roads, but imagine, look at the picture here. You can see that the working class is being used to push along basically the church and the royalty into what they want. So France's nominal attempt at a parliament was called the Estates General, which was established in 1602. Though it had once served as a key role, by the 17th century its importance had declined greatly. In fact, the Estates General did not even meet from 1614 until 1789. So we're talking almost 100 years they didn't even meet together, because you had the church and the king who were ruling most of everything. So let's talk about this third estate. The foundation of any country is its working class, and the third estate had long labored under obsolete tax codes that placed the majority of France's tax burden upon their shoulders. They had to ride the country and pull them along. And this heavy debt already drained on their purses and their pocketbooks. So then we had bad weather in 1780. Nature took its place and crops began to fail, resulting in a shortage of grain. And this pushed the price of bread even higher. And bread was a major staple of the French diet, and it was so high that the French workers couldn't afford to buy bread. And this too was another result of the war. All of these are building blocks up to this new idea of, should the peasants have a better lifestyle? I'm not going to dig real deep into the Enlightenment. Basically, new ideas of society, the social contract. We already discussed these on one of your previous ones. If you need to go back to that and watch some of the videos over the Enlightenment. The American Revolution, what you really need to know is France was a major supporter. Not necessarily that they were for America as a new colony, but they were definitely against Britain and the British people. And in order for them to kind of pay back Britain and form a new alliance with their ability to gain money, remember they were having a financial crisis, they wanted to gain this war and the prestige that came with winning. So they aided the American patriots or rebels fighting against the British. But that didn't necessarily end their financial issue. The expenditures France made on the American Revolution, so they spent more money, along with a lot of money the king had spent to maintain his lavish lifestyle, so the king is still spending money on himself. It began to worsen their financial situation, and the government almost became bankrupt. So King Louis XVI's financial minister, he was a Swiss banker named Jacques Necker, knew that the poor had already been taxed so much that it was impossible for them to create another tax. So Necker proposed levying a tax on all property. This essentially meant that the first and second estates, the church and the nobles, would then have to pay taxes. So needless to say, neither of these groups supported the plan, and since they had all the power, the aristocracy, who saw their exempt from taxation as a birthright, refused to even discuss the issues. The church, which had grown wealthy on tithes and property holdings, it began to reject the idea of paying taxes altogether. And since the first and second estates had the majority of the plan, Necker urged the king to call a meeting of the Estates General in order to get the property tax implemented. So now they're trying to go around the king, go around the people, go around the church. And this Estate General was or Estates General was their way of doing it. Each estate had one vote in the Estates General. So despite the fact that the first and second estates only represented 3% of the population of France, in addition, since the first two estates always voted together, if the third estate disagreed with them, there was little it could do with its single vote. So if all the poor together voted against them, but the church and the nobles or the aristocracy said, no, we don't agree, then they basically vetoed them out. So when the Estate General convened in Versailles in May of 1789, the first and second estates had about 300 delegates each, while the third estate had about 600 delegates. A controversy over voting aroused almost immediately, like who should get the most votes. The third estate demanded that rather than having one vote per estate, each delegate should be given a vote, and this would have allowed the third estate the opportunity to gain a majority. The king, however, rejected the proposal. So the king himself steps in and goes, I am the absolute main authority, and I'm not going to allow that to happen. Now we have something new, the National Assembly. So after weeks of frustrating debate over voting, the representatives of the Third Estate declared themselves a National Assembly and claimed that they were France's true representative body. So they just left and said, we are our own representative body. They invited members of the other states to join them, and some members of the clergy and aristocracy actually did join them. And the National Assembly was inspired by the influential Abbé Sieyès, who had early published a pamphlet that proclaimed the Third Estate and the nation were one, saying you couldn't separate them out. The people are one. Now, of course, with all these decisions being said, the person who is conflicting the most is the king. So King Louis XVI ordered the Third Estate locked out of the National Assembly's meeting hall, said they can't meet. And this basically, the National Assembly responded by moving to a tennis court, where they vowed to leave, and they wouldn't leave until France had a constitution. This was called the Tennis Court Oath, and it gained the assembly popularity among the working class and the poor, and they even drew some of the more open-minded clergy and noblemen onto their side. They began to meet. And on June 17th, the king reversed his position by ordering the two estates to join the National Assembly. He also decided to call French troops into Paris to try and keep a lid on the volatile situation. So the king recognized that there was an issue, and he took the two other groups and said, now I'm going to put you all in, because he could see that there was an uprising coming. He could see the peasants weren't happy, and the peasants outnumbered everybody. But it was too little and most assuredly too late. We're going to talk about the storming of the Bastille. When rumors spread that the king was amassing troops, so mind you, the king was preparing troops to make sure there wasn't a problem, but now rioters started rioting in Paris because the king was pulling troops in, and they were assuming that the king was going to lock them out. And on July 11th, Louis fired Necker, whose advocacy of easing the tax burden on the lower class had made him quite popular among the Third Estate. So the poor really liked this guy, and the king fired him. So mobs began reacting and seizing weapons from one armory and then attacking the Bastille. It was a prison and an armory that was primarily a symbol of royal absolutism. So they didn't attack it just because it was a stronghold that they needed to take over. They attacked it because it was a symbol of the king. So after a fierce battle between the crowd and the prison guards, the Bastille fell. French soldiers had refused to stop the attack, a sign that King Louis was losing further control. And after the battle, the mob completely destroyed the Bastille by burning it. And this fall became a symbol of the revolution. So this was really the great start. And you got to think the soldiers, they didn't want to start killing the peasants right on the spot, so they allowed them to just take over this prison. But there was more that came about, the Great Fear. This revolution quickly spread from one place to another among the countryside, and peasants armed with pitchforks and other rudimentary weapons, they overran estates and country houses and seized and destroyed records, papers, and in order to restore order, the National Assembly abolished feudal privileges on August 4th, thus making all French citizens equal in the eyes of the estate. So trying to get people to calm down, they said, okay, there is no more feudal system, no more feudal lords, everybody is equal. And this is where we get the Declaration of the... The last thing I'm going to end with is the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens. So just as the Declaration of Independence had laid out the ideals of the American Revolution, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizens set forth the ideals of the French Revolution. It was adopted by the new French National Assembly on August 27, 1789. Remember, now people were equal. And the document embodied the Enlightenment concepts of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, and freedom from arbitrary arrest and imprisonment. And I'm going to read through the first 3 articles. 1. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be founded only upon the general good. The aim of all political associations is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These rights are liberty, property, security, and resistance of oppression. 3. The principle of all sovereignty resides essentially in the nation. No body nor individual may exercise any authority which does not proceed directly from the nation. I just want you to think about these, think about how they correlate basically to our Constitution.